The sky over Bonaventure Cemetery was low and gray, the kind of sky that presses down on your shoulders. I stood before the polished granite stone etched with my son's name, Nathaniel Carraway, while my twin grandsons clung to either side of me. Julian's hand was damp in mine, Lucas's grip so tight it hurt, but I welcomed the pain. It was proof that they were still here, still breathing, even if their father was not. The cemetery was hushed, except for the rustle of Spanish moss swaying above us. I whispered a prayer I could barely finish, my voice catching on the word son. Then I heard the crunch of heels on gravel. Maricela arrived without so much as a glance at the grave, dressed in a black dress that looked more suited for a cocktail bar than mourning. She paused near her white BMW, sunglasses, covering eyes I knew weren't wet with tears. My grandsons stiffened. She hadn't even touched them since the funeral began. When she finally walked closer, I hoped, against sense, that she might take their hands, might show a spark of humanity. Instead, she folded her arms and said, her voice sharp as glass, "Disappear with the boys. I'm keeping the money in the beach mansion in Tybee Island." The words knocked the air from my chest. Julian blinked up at me, confusion clouding his wide eyes. Lucas's mouth opened, but no sound came. I wanted to shield them from her cruelty, but her voice carried, deliberate and cutting. I felt the ground tilt beneath me as the truth sank in. She wasn't grieving. She was calculating. My son was gone, and his wife had chosen fortune over family. I tightened my hold on the boy's hands, already sensing the storm that would follow. 3 days after the funeral, a knock at my door came just as the sun was lowering over the Savannah River. I opened it to see Maricela standing there, arms crossed, 2 suitcases at her feet. Julian and Lucas stood behind her, their eyes wide, shoulders tense. "They're yours now," she said, her tone casual, like she was handing off a borrowed coat. Before I could form words, she turned, her heels clicking against the sidewalk. The boys reached for her, but she didn't even look back as she slid into her car and pulled away. I stood frozen in the doorway until Julian whispered, "Grandma." That broke me loose. I ushered them inside, my mind racing as I set the suitcases by the couch. The apartment was small, just 1 bedroom and a pull-out sofa, but it was all I had. That night, I made them scrambled eggs and toast, the only food I had left from the week. They ate silently, eyes down, as if afraid speaking too loudly might shatter what was left of their world. I wanted to tell them everything would be fine, but the truth weighed heavy. My pension barely covered rent, and now I had 2 growing boys to raise. Word traveled fast in Savannah. By the end of the week, whispers reached me that Maricela had been spotted in Miami, laughing in glittering clubs, posting photos from poolside bars. Some neighbors clucked their tongues in sympathy, others in judgment. I ignored them all. What mattered now was keeping Julian and Lucas safe. That night, when I tucked them into the bed, I had given up for them. I sat on the sofa with tears staining my blouse. My son was gone, and his wife had cast his children aside like baggage. I stared at the ceiling, realizing my life had split in 2 before that knock, and after, and in the silence. I knew survival would depend on more than faith. It would depend on resilience I wasn't sure I still possessed. The weeks that followed were a blur of adjustments, the kind that left no time to grieve. My pension check wasn't enough, so I took a job as a custodian in an office building downtown. The hours were long and unforgiving, mopping hallways until my knees throbbed, scrubbing restrooms until my hands cracked. But it was steady pay, and steady meant the boys would eat, most nights. Julian and Lucas came with me. I set them up in the break room, their backpacks spread out on folding chairs. Lucas bent over borrowed textbooks, lips moving silently as he copied case notes. Julian tinkered with whatever old electronics the tenants had left for disposal. One evening, I found him with a dismantled computer tower. Wires splayed like veins, his brow furrowed. But when he looked up, there was a spark I hadn't seen in months. "I think I can make it run again," he whispered, as if fixing a dead machine might bring back something else we had lost. Lucas, meanwhile, lived in the world of rules and precedents. At 12, he was too young to understand why the law had let Maricela keep the mansion and the money. But he read until his eyes burned. "It isn't fair," he muttered one night, slamming shut a book on family law. I had no answer. Fairness had never paid our bills. By the time we returned home each dawn, the city was already waking, and my body begged for sleep. I learned to rest in snatches an hour here, half an hour there while the boys prepared themselves for school. Some days, exhaustion made me stumble, but I kept my head high when neighbors saw us, refusing to let pity define us. Julian's machines began to hum and light up. Lucas's notes filled stacks of binders, and in their persistence, I saw something I hadn't felt since Nathaniel's death. The possibility that hardship could be reshaped into strength. It was a quiet kind of hope, but it kept me moving, even as the nights stretched into years. By the time the boys turned 15, the rhythm of our lives had settled into something that almost looked like routine. I still worked nights in the office building, but now the boys hardly needed me hovering over them. Julian carried his battered laptop everywhere, typing with a speed that left my head spinning. He had gone from fixing discarded computers to writing his own code, little programs that solved problems for people online. I didn't understand half of what he was building, but I understood enough when he handed me $50 one evening and said, "Someone bought my app, Grandma." Lucas, meanwhile, had turned debate into his battlefield. He joined the high school team, and I sat in the back of the auditorium at every tournament, clutching my purse like it was the last thing keeping me upright. He spoke with a fire that belied his age, arguing family law, inheritance rights, and fairness with the precision of someone twice his years. Teachers told me he had a gift, but I knew it was more than talent. It was hunger, sharpened by the wound his mother had left behind. At night, when I came home bone-tired, I sometimes overheard the boys whispering in their room. Julian talked about new projects, algorithms, ideas he couldn't wait to test. Lucas countered with strategies. How to protect those ideas from being stolen, how contracts and laws could shield them from exploitation. It was as if they were already preparing for a battle no one else could see. I was proud. How could I not be? They were turning scraps into stepping stones. Yet beneath that pride was a shadow. Their determination carried an edge, a tightness that worried me. I had seen what bitterness could do to people, how it corroded from within. I feared they weren't just chasing dreams, but running from anger, from the memory of Maricela's voice telling them they weren't wanted. Still, I held on to hope. Maybe brilliance born from pain could grow into something lasting, something untainted. I prayed their gifts would lead them toward creation and not destruction. And then, on a quiet evening as I folded laundry, Julian and Lucas asked me to sit down. The kitchen table had always been our gathering place. We had eaten countless meals there. Scrambled eggs, beans over rice, peanut butter sandwiches when things were lean. That table had held homework, old bills, and the weight of years spent stretching pennies. But that evening, when the twins asked me to sit down, I felt something different in the air. Julian was jittery, his leg bouncing beneath the chair, while Lucas had a stack of papers neatly arranged in front of him. I braced myself for bad news, maybe trouble at school, or worse, Something about Maricela. Instead, Julian cleared his throat and said, "Grandma, we need to tell you something important." I nodded, waiting, my chest tightening. Julian pushed his laptop toward me, the screen glowing with numbers and graphs I didn't understand. The app I built, the one for small businesses to manage their finances, someone wants to buy it. Not just someone, but a company in Atlanta, a big one. I blinked, trying to absorb his words. Buy it. For how much? Lucas slid the top paper from the stack and handed it to me. His voice was calm, steady, like he'd been rehearsing. "We've been negotiating for months. They finalized the offer today." He looked at Julian, then back at me. $2.4 billion. For a moment, I thought I had misheard. I stared at the number printed on the page. So many zeros it blurred together. My hands trembled as I set it back down. "Billion," I whispered. Julian gave me a shy smile. "Yeah, Grandma, billion." The room tilted, and I gripped the edge of the table. Images rushed through my mind those nights watching Julian type under a flickering lamp. Lucas poring over thick legal texts. The two of them whispering about futures I thought were only dreams. Now, here it was. Real and staggering. I reached for them both, my hands covering theirs. "How did you even—" Lucas's eyes softened. "We didn't want to tell you until it was certain. I used what I've been learning at Emory to review the contracts. We made sure everything is protected. Julian keeps creative control. And we avoid traps." Tears blurred my vision. My grandsons, once left at my doorstep with 2 suitcases, were now among the richest young men in the country. I drew a breath, steadying myself, though my heart raced. Wealth had destroyed Maricela, but maybe, just maybe, it could be different for them. And before I could find the right words, news of Maricela's unraveling reached us. The news of Maricela's unraveling reached us through whispers at first. An old neighbor from Tibet Island mentioned the mansion was no longer hers. Alone, banks had stacked mortgages against it. Someone else passed word of cars repossessed in the middle of the night. The glittering life she flaunted in Miami had been built on a crumbling foundation, and it was finally giving way. I shouldn't have cared, but part of me couldn't look away. For years, she had strutted across photographs, a glass in hand, men draped at her side, while I scrubbed office floors just to put food in Julian's and Lucas's mouths. Now creditors were circling, and the gossip hinted at something darker: fraud. Forged documents, lies written into loan applications. The boys knew too. Julian remained quiet, burying himself in coding. But Lucas's jaw tightened whenever her name was spoken. He was in his 2nd year at Emory, interning with a respected Atlanta law firm. One evening, he came home pale, his voice steady, but eyes clouded. "She came in today," he said simply. I didn't understand at first. "Who, Maricela?" She scheduled an emergency consultation. He sank into a chair, loosening his tie. "She didn't know I was there until I introduced myself. Grandma, you should have seen her face. I imagined it, the woman who once told me to disappear with her children, now sitting across from the son she abandoned." Lucas described how she froze, her manicured hand trembling against the polished table. For the first time in years, her poise cracked. She asked if I could handle her case. He continued, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I told her the firm would review it. Nothing more." I said nothing, only reached across to cover his hand. Beneath the anger in his eyes, I saw the boy who once whispered to me at night, asking why his mother didn't want him. Now she was forced to face him, not as a child, but as a man with the power to decide her fate. And in that shift, I knew the balance of our lives had changed forever. We met her in a conference room high above Atlanta, the kind with glass walls and a view that stretched for miles. Julian sat at the head of the table, calm in his dark suit, while Lucas laid a neat stack of papers before him. I sat close enough to steady them with my presence. Though I said little, Maricela entered late, her heels clicking on the polished floor. The glamour she once wore like armor had thinned. Her hair was brittle, her clothes no longer the labels she used to flaunt. For a moment, I almost pitied her, but then I remembered the day at Nathaniel's grave. Julian spoke first. His tone measured. "You're facing lawsuits, foreclosure, and criminal charges. We can resolve it. But it comes with conditions." Her eyes flicked between them, wary. "What conditions?" Lucas slid the contract across the table. "We'll settle your debts and provide you with a modest apartment. In exchange, you'll work for Julian's company as a receptionist. 5 years. Standard office hours. Salary is basic. With benefits. If you refuse, bankruptcy proceeds and prison is likely." The color drained from her face. She picked up the papers, scanning quickly, then tossed them down as if they burned her. "Receptionist. For my own children." Julian leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "We survived as children with nothing. Now you'll learn what that means as an adult." Her lips trembled, pride warring with fear. For a long stretch of silence, she stared at the contract, the city lights flickering against the glass. Finally, her shoulders sagged. She lifted the pen with a shaking hand and scrawled her name at the bottom. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time, the power was not hers to wield. The balance had shifted, and she knew it. When she slid the papers back across the table, Julian nodded once. Businesslike. Lucas gathered the documents without a word, and in that moment, I understood we had crossed into a new chapter, one where the boys no longer carried the weight of abandonment, but the authority of choice. Her first day came on a Tuesday. I accompanied Julian to the office, more out of habit than necessity. At 8 sharp, the elevator doors opened, and Maricela stepped out. Gone were the tailored designer dresses. In their place was a plain navy suit, the kind sold off the rack. Her makeup was subdued, her hair pulled back too tightly, as though she were trying to restrain every last fragment of vanity. She sat behind the reception desk, carefully answering phones, taking messages, and directing visitors with a politeness I had never heard from her before. While clients moved toward the boardroom, their eyes lingered on her. Confused perhaps by the contrast, the receptionist was the mother of the young CEO they'd come to meet. She bore their stares in silence, her back straight, but her pride clearly fraying. I stayed most mornings, a quiet presence in the corner, watching the rhythm of this strange new life. Julian and Lucas moved through meetings with confidence, handling contracts and negotiations with precision, and Maricela watched them, watched what they had built without her, while she arranged schedules and sorted mail. One afternoon, when the office had quieted, I walked past her desk and stopped short. She had her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking. The sound was soft, but different from the crocodile tears she once used as weapons. These were not for show. When she looked up, her eyes were rimmed red. "I see them," she whispered, glancing toward the glass-walled conference room where Julian and Lucas were finishing a presentation. "I see what they've become, and I know it's not because of me. It's despite me." I said nothing, only placed a hand on her desk, a gesture of presence, more than forgiveness. She lowered her gaze, ashamed, and for the first time I wondered if regret had finally cracked her shell. That night, as I walked the boys out to the car, I sensed that the shift we had long waited for was only beginning. A year passed before we returned to Bonaventure together. The morning was quiet, sunlight slipping through the moss-hung oaks, and the boys carried fresh flowers in their hands. I had visited many times alone, but this time was different. Maricela walked beside us, her steps measured, her gaze fixed on the ground. When we reached Nathaniel's stone, Julian knelt to place the flowers, his jaw tight. Lucas stood with his arms folded, silent, his eyes on me as though asking for guidance. I rested a hand on his shoulder before turning to Maricela. She stepped closer to the grave, her voice breaking as she spoke. I know I cannot undo what I did. I cannot erase the choices that hurt all of you. But I am asking, if I may try to be part of your lives, not as before, not without limits, but slowly, on your terms. The boys exchanged a long look, one of those silent conversations only twins can have. Julian's lips pressed into a thin line, while Lucas's brow furrowed in thought. At last, Julian gave a small nod. With boundaries, he said firmly. Lucas added, you'll have to earn our trust, every step of the way. Maricela swallowed hard, her eyes shining with tears. That's more than I deserve, but I will try. I watched them together, my heart heavy yet strangely lighter. The same cemetery where betrayal had begun now held the first fragile thread of reconciliation. As we walked back through the shaded path, I felt the boys on either side of me, taller now, steadier, their presence anchoring me as much as I had once anchored them. And I knew the path forward would test us all. The new house in Atlanta was larger than anything I had ever lived in. But what struck me most was not its size. It was the way the boys filled it with life. Julian's office hummed with the quiet rhythm of servers and code, while Lucas's books and case files seemed to multiply across every surface. They were no longer children surviving on scraps. They were men shaping their own world. I often sat by the kitchen window, watching them argue good-naturedly over contracts or tease each other about who worked harder. Their wealth was staggering. Yet what I cherished most was the way they carried it. No arrogance, no cruelty, just determination and a quiet sense of responsibility. Maricela came by sometimes, still dressed simply, her voice softer than I had ever known it to be. She never overstepped. She poured coffee, offered to help with errands, and kept her promises. Each small act chipped away at the distance, though the boys kept their boundaries firm. Forgiveness, I realized, was not a single moment, but a slow, deliberate practice. At night, when the house grew quiet, I thought of Nathaniel. He had left behind no mansion, no secure fortune, only 2 sons and the mother who loved them. That, I realized, was the real inheritance, not what could be taken, squandered, or stolen, but what could endure. Julian and Lucas had turned betrayal into resilience, grief into purpose. Even Maricela, once hollow with greed, was learning that survival required humility, not excess. I looked at them and felt peace settle over me. Money might crumble, houses might fall, but the courage to endure that was the one inheritance no one could erase.